Hi everybody, it's Sherry Schoenberg here. I'm with the University of Vermont Center on Disability and Community Inclusion, and I'm happy to be here today. My job is that I'm the coordinator of the Vermont BEST project, and that project supports schools all across the state in increasing their capacity to address the needs of students who might be at risk of or who have emotional behavioral disabilities. So this is our work, professional development for educators. And I'm happy to talk to you about the topic of crisis and de-escalation strategies. We're going to talk today about a lot of simple strategies to help de-escalate a potential crisis. Things you've probably already done and that you have in your own personal toolkit, but in a way that may be more organized for you so you can think about sort of where to intervene along the way and sort of putting some of your best ideas together in one place. And as we know, you really can't change someone else's behavior. You can only change your own, and that's why I like the approach that we're talking about here today regarding crisis, as this allows us to look at our own behavior and things that we can do differently in hopes that the child in our care might be responsive. So most of the material is adapted from the Crisis Prevention Institute, and then that's an organization that supports states and counties and schools across the country on de-escalation, personal safety, and nonviolent intervention. And I've been a Crisis Prevention Institute trainer since 1996. And have actually trained thousands of educators in these strategies. So that's where I thought to draw the material from today. Also, there's another model of crisis intervention called life space crisis intervention, and some of the material in this webinar is adapted from there. It's a really simple set of strategies, and so I hope you'll ask questions, and I'm just looking at the questions on the board at the same time, and just create a dialogue here. The reason why the cover slide is a picture of a waterfall is because when I think about crisis or children or students that are really significantly out of control, I use a visualization. I picture myself as a big rock in the middle of a raging stream. And it's that visualization that helps me be strong and helps me be calm with all the chaos around me. I like to visualize that. And that's just sort of one thing you can do when you think about situations that are really getting kind of scary for you, how you can center yourself. And this is just the way that I do that. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? We're going to define crisis a little bit and what it means for this webinar today. Because everybody has a different definition of crisis, sort of what it might look like in its components parts. And then those 10 tips for crisis prevention, and as I said, you probably already have lots of these, but putting them together and thinking about them intentionally is where we're going with this. And after that section of this webinar, we're going to talk about sort of how to think about debriefing following the crisis, because that's where the cathartic moment happens with someone who might be going in a crisis. It's sort of where the defenses are dropped and time to maybe rebuild rapport and think about what to do differently next time. And obviously along the way we'll address questions. So what's a crisis? Aha! For purposes of this webinar, it can be defined as a point in time when a child in our care begins to lose rational thought, which could involve also physical out-of-control behavior. So I like to think about it as when a child really just is unable to use the thinking part of his or her brain and the emotions start flooding in. So it's really where it's very, very hard to be rational, and so verbal communication and cues like that may not be as effective because there are blinders on the child and there's been some sort of release so that this person has lost control. And so when we talk about this, we're talking about what you can do as that might be escalating and beginning to happen. Crisis can be broken down a bit by thinking about what you see leading up to a crisis. And you may not always see it, but you could see behaviors that are a manifestation of anxiety with when the child in your care is acting differently. And this is something you would need to look for. But if you let me just ask a question here. Is there a way to get them to raise their, can I see people here? Little technical issue here, just working on it. Okay, great. Okay, yeah, if we could leave that up, that'd be great. Thank you. So let me just ask you, how many of you are, if you could raise your hand using the icon on your screen, I don't know if you can see it, but we're going to try to ask you to raise your hand if you're here because you have a particular child in mind. Okay, a couple people are starting to raise their hands. Yep. Okay, great. Great, thank you. Okay, so you'll be thinking about your particular child as we go through this webinar. That's really terrific. So you may or may not see this, but here's sort of a linear progression that may happen before crisis occurs. The first thing you might see is anxiety, as I said, and that's where students or child is acting differently. They may increase pacing or tapping a pencil or shutting doors back and forth, or maybe withdrawn kind of behaviors where you're seeing head down on the desk or on the table, but something that's different from ordinary kind of behavior, and that's something to look for and kind of where the hardest work happens, because usually when we see someone that's beginning to show those signs of anxiety, especially if we're teachers in a class, we might be crossing our fingers, crossing our toes, crossing our arms, and hoping that things work out all right. This is a great place to be supportive, though, and to really use sort of your best strategies around trying to help the person alleviate their anxiety by maybe finding something that's a little bit easier for them to tolerate emotionally at this point. So you may see anxiety. You also may see the child begin to lose rational thought. And that would be manifested by maybe being a little bit defensive and not really focus on the verbal communication that's happening, but being a little threatening in his or her behavior. And then crisis would be the release, the verbal or the physical total acting out behavior, total loss of rational thought. So there are things that we can do in the anxiety phase. In the defensive phase, we need to take over a little bit more and begin to set limits while maintaining a positive approach to the child in our care. And then when crisis happens, we start moving toward thinking about safety and allowing it to escalate safely so that when it ends, we can do the hard work of regaining that rapport with the child. Please ask any questions. Here's one question that says, when they have a mood disorder, how can you tell they are headed for a crisis? Well, I'm not really sure what that mood disorder might look like for the child, but really when I'm talking about crisis, we're looking at what are the behaviors that you see, and how have they changed for you? How do they look different from before? And that's where you might be having some idea of what's happening. And then being able to like really investigate what happens before, during, and after the total explosion that occurs for a child. So this is where you need to be able to objectively look at what's happening before the out-of-control behavior for any student or child, and maybe this would help you with the child that you're referring to. Okay, here's just another really important point to make, is that children or kids in stress create in adults their feelings, and it's really easy for us as the adults, the people who are highly responsible, to mirror what's going on with the children. And so that's why trainings like this, or practice, or reflection with other support people is really important when you've got children that may be losing rational thought on a regular basis and getting verbally or physically out of control. So we need to think about this in a way that's going to allow us to respond without escalating. And I visualize here an escalator. And that's where when a child might be getting anxious, I start to get anxious. A child starts getting defensive, I start getting defensive, and I keep going up the escalator. And if we are able to consider this framework of de-escalation and response, we want to see what we can do to help go down the escalator as opposed to ratcheting it up. And that takes, again, a lot of personal reflection and some practice and some training and debriefing following a crisis so you can think about what to do next time. I'm just going to ask, there's some question marks here. Is that something we need to do? Okay. So an example might be asking a child to do homework and the child yells and screams, who knows, maybe something happened on the bus, and then we begin to yell and scream ourselves, as opposed to setting the limits in a calm voice and providing choices. So that's what we're trying to do here, is really feel like we're a little bit more competent. This is a slide from Life Space Crisis Intervention, and I really just appreciate the visualization here. Unfortunately, it talks about staff student, and I know a lot of you are parents, but I didn't have the skills to change the slide. But if you think about crisis and your involvement in a crisis situation, there are basically three outcomes that can happen. One is, in your role to help de-escalate and calm the situation, you could end up having an improved relationship with the child as a result, because you've been helpful and you've kept them feeling safe and under control. And that's really where we're aiming. There's also a possibility that in your role in supporting the child in crisis, that debriefing might not be happening, or you've got some of your own stuff going on, but you kept the child safe and able to move on, and that's where that relationship is unchanged, and that's okay. But what we really don't want to get to is the result of a crisis being a damaged relationship between the adult and the child, and that's where when we begin to escalate and be counter-aggressive, we need to be thinking about what skills we can have and improve to help improve the relationship with the child. I'm seeing another question. What do you do when your support people don't know what to do to help you? Well, again, that's a really good question, and that's a loaded question. But probably a common one, and something that needs some serious attention. And I don't have the magic answer, other than I think a child that may be going in and out of crisis on a regular basis really deserves to have a team of support people around the child and the family members, so that you can make the best the best changes for the child together, sharing risks, sharing ideas, sharing strategies. And, you know, a lot of us don't really know what to do. And being in a comfortable team setting where people can sort of admit that and try to develop the competencies and the attitudes to make some changes together is really where we need to get at, is how can we work together to make these changes and what are the best ideas. There's a lot of training out there that educators could get, and they may not know about it, but ideally your team around the child in your care should be developing the practices together. There's a question about the session being recorded. Will it be available somewhere to share with the team that's helping the child? Yes. Okay. Well, I guess it'll be on YouTube afterwards, and you can find it on the VFN website, and I think we're going to conclude the program letting you know about that a little bit more detail. The other thing to say here is that I mentioned I was from the BEST project, which is a University of Vermont project. If you have the capacity to Google the Vermont BEST project, you can see a lot of training that we offer in crisis prevention and intervention, and maybe avail yourselves of that. Okay, so the other point to make is that crisis doesn't happen by appointment. We can't be ready and wearing the right clothing and have the time set aside to address a crisis, you know, and they're usually chaotic and unpredictable, and that's why we need to have a plan. And the best time to create a plan is when you're not in crisis. And a lot of times we might be just like sighing in relief that the situation has ended. And that's good. That's important to do. We need to gain back our own equilibrium, but it's really critical in working with a child or living with a child who's going to do this on a regular basis to develop some sort of plan so that you're ready. And again, the plan would look like creating a set of supportive responses for when you see anxiety, and creating a set of limits for when you see defensive behaviors so that you can really sort of intervene at the right time without having to overreact or underreact. And then what are you going to do if something's out of control? Sort of knowing that in advance, maybe having a script of what you're going to do and say, because again, you're potentially going up the escalator yourself. So having some sort of script to prepare yourself and prepare your team, let's say, is really, really, really helpful. That was the wrong way. Sorry, guys. Thank you. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. So here's 10 tips for crisis prevention, just like a commercial. But before we get to that, I'm looking at another question. If you go in and out of crisis and the crisis center doesn't know where to send you to get the help you need to figure out the mood disorder and how to treat it. If you go in and out of so for the person that's asking this question, that sounds like there's a lot more detail in there to be able to answer in this webinar, and I'm happy to share my email at the end and provide some suggestions if possible. Oh, you could also call the Vermont Family Network as well, and I believe there will be information about that at the end of the webinar. So I'm not trying to cut you off. I'm just thinking that maybe that would be most beneficial for you. Okay, let's go into these tips. Remember, I said you got a lot of these attitudes and skills and competencies already, but it's important to talk about them all in one place. So being empathic, that's a great word. Being empathic is being someone who can provide a non-judgmental response to alleviating anxiety. And really what it comes down to is figuring out how you can be supportive of a child who's beginning to get agitated, however you describe that, and that's important to describe, but figuring out how you can listen, provide your undivided attention without judgment, because we don't always know the reason why a child might be acting out. And we need to go in assuming that there's a reason behind their behavior. And hopefully in being empathic and trying to listen and show the child that you are wanting to hear them, him or her, that will allow the child to perhaps give back to you and let you know what's really going on. You know, I can think about a situation when a teacher I was working with just asked a student for his lunch money, and he threw the lunch money at the teacher, and that was just, it was like really not okay behavior. It was inappropriate behavior, and she needed to intervene, and he did a little observational timeout and picked up the money and all that stuff. And she came to find out later that the child's dog had died that morning before school. So we don't always know, and we can't always find out what's going on before they get into this agitated state. Sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't. And so the assumption here is that no matter what, we should try to be non-judgmental and hear what it is they're, whether they're irrational beliefs or not, where the student is coming from. So that's really key in terms of being empathic. Okay. The second tip is clarify the messages. So again, you know, when things are beginning to at least verbally escalate, there's a lot of chaos, and we keep going back to the fact that it's chaos. And as the child is beginning to lose rational thought, communication can start breaking down, and this is where we need to develop our active listening skills. Summarize what you're hearing, asking some clarifying questions, and it goes along with being empathic, letting them know you really want to hear them, and letting them know that you're trying to understand them by active listening. Also, what's the real message? Sometimes there's all this verbal diarrhea, Ross Greene calls it, or verbal vomiting, terrible words, but you know, what's the real message behind all that chaotic language? And if you can tease that out using your I statements, that's where you're going to, again, be able to help the child sort of think through, become more rational, because there's some trust there that you're listening to me. Oftentimes, we hear from children that are in this place that they say, "You're not listening to me," and they may raise their voice and repeat themselves or shut down. And so we want to open the lines of communication by saying, "I really am really interested in what you have to say. I'm giving you my undivided attention." Here's another tip that you probably already know, and it's about personal space and respecting personal space. Everybody has their own comfort zone, and in which we're comfortable in being around other people. And in the United States, in our society, it's somewhere around 1.5 to 3 feet long. And that's really the distance that we feel comfortable engaging with people. And this little picture is a person who's showing arm's length distance is the personal space that's really important to her. And if you stand in that, she's going to become uncomfortable, and she's going to become anxious, and it might escalate her behavior. And so as much as it may not seem a big deal, if you just practice it with your partner, well, maybe not your partner, but perhaps colleagues at work, and you move closer to them, which I'm doing right now. You see the giggling? That's positive anxiety. Or hear the giggling? That's positive anxiety. So personal space is really huge, and it also extends to the individual's belongings. So sometimes backpacks can cause a lot of anxiety when you're going into a child's backpack because there's such a sense of ownership and anxiety about what's in it and how that belongs to them. So again, in your large toolbox of strategies around crisis prevention, being aware of the personal space of others is really, it's a big, big deal. And we also know that developmentally it's different. So younger children basically don't have personal space. They may be sitting on your lap all the time and wanting to put their fingers in your hair. And as they get older, there's an increased distance between people. But paying attention to the child in your care and what their personal space issues will really go far to helping that child when you're combining it with the other strategies and you are paying attention to that. I'm seeing another question. How do you figure out what is bothering a child when at a time they are not able to verbalize what is going on? Yeah, okay, so that definitely seems to be a theme, and there are several ways to do it, and it might not necessarily be during the crisis. It could be after the crisis when you're debriefing. Now, I'm not sure if you're saying that this child is nonverbal, and in that case, there are a set of strategies. But if the child is paying attention to things like personal space, being open to hearing and clarifying messages, waiting it out. We're going to get to that a little bit. Until you have that chance to interact and move into rationality. Those are some of the strategies that I can suggest by the basic nature of the question. Here's another strategy, and what I'm realizing is I've never really looked at the full screen of these slides, so the pictures are a little fuzzy. Sorry about that. But anyway, being aware of your own body position. So you're respecting the child's personal space, but then think about your own position. And are you actually face-to-face with that child when you're engaging with the child around these really troubling feelings and behaviors that are going on? Or can you stand to the side? Usually when you sort of step back a little bit and move to the side and your body is a little bit at an angle, it's much less confrontative. So not only be thinking about avoiding the child's, staying out of the child's comfort zone, but thinking about how you hold your body is also really important in terms of being a helping person for the child that's really losing rational thought. Okay. So another strategy, we're at strategy 5 out of 10, is ignoring challenging questions. So especially when you're involved in supporting a child to complete tasks, and we see this a lot in schools with educators asking the children to do assignments that may seem difficult to the child or that the child is trying to avoid, we get some questions. And the tip here really is that when a child that's beginning to lose rational thought starts to ask questions, the ones that are productive are the ones that should be answered. Which book should I be going to right now? Answering and redirecting is really good. Where do you want me to stand in the hallway? What assignment again is it that we're doing? All those questions are productive questions that keep within the normal limits of what you're doing at that time. When the child starts getting defensive, which again that really can characterize the beginning of loss of rational thought, they might start asking some challenging and threatening kinds of questions like, who's going to make me? Who do you think you are telling me to do this? Or why are you picking on me? Or stuff like that. So those would be some challenging questions. And that's where redirecting to the answer to the productive question is the way to go. Trying to ignore those kinds of challenges and redirecting to what it is you were communicating with the child about is really critical. So, and that will hopefully allow the child to get back to what's been going on for him or her within the context of the environment. So, for productive questions, what book do you want me to, did you want me to sleep the floor in the bedroom or in the living room? Answer those questions. Answer all those productive questions. They're gaining clarification. When the questions become challenging, like, who's going to make me do that? Or why do you always pick on me? Those you want to try to ignore as much as possible and redirect to the task. And then you might get into needing to set limits at that point. But before we get into limits, if a child is asking questions and try to redirect back to task and getting really challenging, they might just say, "No way, I'm not doing it," or have some kind of verbal release, which could look like screaming and yelling, and it could look like this fuzzy boy in the picture here who is really, this is looking like a total loss of rational thought. Have you ever lost your temper? I'm assuming that a lot of you would answer yes to that. Have you ever had a tantrum yourself where you might be yelling and screaming for a short period of time? At that point, you've pretty much lost rational thought, and you might be saying things you're going to regret later. Well, when a child in our care gets to this place, this child has really kind of lost it, shall we say. And what you do here is, if you can, allow that venting to occur for as much as possible, because at that point it's really hard to do anything other than be supportive around when there is a valley in the peaks and valleys of verbal acting out. So when you think about it, if you're yelling and screaming, at the top of your lungs, at some point you get physically tired, and so there's going to be a calm in between perhaps the next burst, and it's waiting for those valleys to intervene that can be really effective for you. And one way to do that is to validate the child's feeling. You see that they're scared or they're angry or they're confused, but it's hard for you to listen to the person when they're screaming, and you'd really like to hear what they have to say. Those are the kinds of responses you can provide when there's that verbal venting. A lot of times we think we have to, no matter what, control that verbal acting out immediately, and that's not going to always be possible. So if we can prepare for how to find those valleys and use I statements to let them know, it's like, I really see that you're angry, and I'd like to hear what you have to say, but I can't hear you when you're screaming like that. That's really effective in helping the child see that you're there to support him or her. I'm just going to stop right now. Are there any questions that people want to ask by typing into their question box? I'll wait a moment. These awkward pauses happen all the time. Just was going to scroll down here. Okay, it must be you're also riveted to hear what's going to come next. Okay, so we've now allowed the venting to occur, wait for the valleys, and try to intervene by using I statements and letting them know you really want to hear what they have to say. Also, real important is to think about setting and enforcing reasonable limits. And then again, I messages are really important in trying to support a child and keep from getting into that conflicting escalation with the child. And so when a child might be asking those challenging questions, you might have to set some limits. It's really great to set those limits, know what those limits will be in advance, because the limits that you set need to be really reasonable. I know I made the mistake when my children were growing up and they hadn't cleaned their rooms by grounding them for 2 weeks. And that was maybe a little bit less reasonable than something that would be clean your room, and if it stays clean for the next couple days, you can go out on Friday night, that kind of thing. So thinking about what those limits are in advance and making sure they're reasonable and enforceable. I had a teacher who gave a child detention for every Wednesday for the rest of the year for an acting out behavior. And so what that meant to the teacher was that he needed to be there every Wednesday after school for the rest of the year. So you got to make sure that these that the limits that you set are both reasonable and enforceable. And after several weeks of this Wednesday afternoon detention, the teacher went and apologized to the student and said, you know, I'm really sorry. I set this this consequence that really isn't reasonable, and I'm not able to enforce it. So we need to sort of step back and look at this behavior and end the way it's going right now. And there's nothing wrong with saying you're sorry for a way that you set a limit that might not be reasonable. It's not. There's absolutely nothing wrong with saying sorry. Oh, we got a question. Oh, I believe I said in the beginning of the webinar, I might have not said that I will not be talking about how what to do when children are physically aggressive. We think that it's really important to understand the dynamics going on with that child and look at all these prevention strategies, which are great de-escalation prevention strategies for whether they're verbally or physically out of control. But in a webinar that's for an hour, it really doesn't do justice to help children be physically safe as well as emotionally safe when they get physically out of control. That's training that we do best done with an individual team that's working around a child. If the child continues to physically act out, what we would do physically to support that child until they're calm. Having said that, all the strategies we're talking about also work well in either case. Okay. Happy to explain. Oh, thanks, Christine. All right. Oops. Sorry. Okay, let's go on before I get myself in trouble. Another thing you got to do is focus on your nonverbal cues. You know, it's really interesting. We think we communicate through talking to others, and that's how we communicate. But so much of communication happens nonverbally. It's like 45% of how we communicate happens with our nonverbal cues and our nonverbal gestures. So again, as you know, in being the helping person, it's real important to figure out sort of what's your body language. Are you crossing your arms really tight, and do you have a scowl on your face? Are you pointing to the child in an accusatory manner? Be careful to think about how you're standing as well as what you're gesturing with your hands. And so I like to sort of stand facing at an angle to the child who may be escalating with my hands to my sides and really sort of lean forward to show that I'm really interested in what they have to say, and try not to use gestures as much as possible. That's something that would take practice. Sometimes we don't know what our bodies are telling other people. So being aware of your gestures like that is really important. Okay, another fuzzy picture, I'm sorry. We need to be careful to avoid overreacting, which is something we as parents of adolescents, like this mom, has done. And one strategy to help us with that is to really actually make a concrete list of the kinds of behaviors that really throw us off, the ones that really set us off balance and make us go up that escalator. What are those things? And you can categorize the things that, you know, that might come out when a child's acting out that really don't bother you, the things that are sort of bothersome, and the other things. Just making that list helps you de-stress a little bit when these things come up, because you've identified them and you can be thinking about them, and you can say these things might come up. She might tell me that I look like a witch with my face going all scrunchy, and I hate that because I'm getting older, I'm getting scrunchy anyway, and it just drives me crazy when somebody's calling me a witch. I'm gonna be aware that this might be something that comes at me. So just writing it down makes a really big difference. So that will allow us to prevent overreacting. Okay, one more strategy. Use the least restrictive interventions. So all those 9 preceding strategies of setting limits and being empathic and watching for our own nonverbal cues and working with challenging questions, all those things are really the most powerful interventions you can use with children who may be coming out of control, acting out verbally or aggressively. That's where the hardest effort goes in. When a child begins to physically act out to a place where they're in danger of hurting themselves or others, your therapeutic approach sort of moves from all those supportive kinds of responses that we talked about in the other 9 strategies to making sure everybody is safe, including the child as well as yourself. So that's a whole set of strategies that you want to be careful of. If and when you're going to put your hands on a child, it really should have to do with it being a last resort when all else has failed, and when there's a risk of endangering self or others. And it's real important to be trained in how to hold someone safely and then how to get out of that as quickly as possible. And that's just, as I said, something that we really can't talk about in this webinar. So all those supportive strategies when you see anxiety behavior are really critical to preventing the behavior from getting to the point of total loss of rational thought. And that's what we mean here when we talk about our least restrictive interventions. Any questions before we change gears a little bit? Okie dokie. So I think about a kite when I think about crisis, because what comes up must come down. We got the kite going out, going up and up and up and up and up, and there's a release, and things are wobbly up there for a while, but at some point there's an end to the crisis. And how do we know the crisis is over? That's something for you also to be thinking about with a child in your care. How do you know they've begun to gain rational thought back? And I think you would see that usually in their body language. You may see crying. You may see sleeping. You may see a body that's sort of not moving, head down on a desk. All kinds of ways to know that the child is in rational thought. And one way you can find out is you can ask, can you hear what I'm saying now? I see that your body is calm. Are you willing to talk now? So this is a model, coping, that we call coping, that could help you through debriefing so that you can all regain sort of a freedom following a crisis. Because I don't know about you, but when a child is acting out significantly, where they're verbally or physically releasing, when that's happening and when that's over, I could get kind of a pit in my belly and really feel uncomfortable about that. And this process of debriefing is really what will allow you to maybe release some of that tension that you feel, both for yourself and for the child in your care. So I'm going to go over what happens during this coping model of debriefing for both the child and for the adult. And it's like something that's COPING. We'll show you here. Okay, so the first thing you want to do after a crisis is make sure that the child is in rational thought, gain rationale, and under emotional and physical control. And I just mentioned some of the ways you would know that. Just as important, making sure that you as the adult are also under control again. Have you come down from the escalator because you probably went up at least a little bit, unless of course you're highly trained and you're in this crisis work all the time. And a way to do that would be perhaps talking to other adults, taking a walk, really thinking about what happened in order to assess yourself and whether you're back under control. So that's the C. So now we're getting into the debriefing part, or how are we going to move on from here. And this is where those listening skills come in again, and this is the opportunity for the child to state what happened. How did the child see what just happened? What happened before the behavior? Was there something going on the bus on the way home? What triggered it, and what did you do? Asking those questions and helping the child really be able to tell you what their experience was really goes a long way to both calming down and coming up for the plan to prevent that in the future. And that's where those non-judgmental active listening skills come in. You may have a different view of it, but at this point you are listening to the child and how they've experienced. The adult then should have the opportunity to establish what the basic facts of the incident were from the adult perspective, not necessarily countering the child's experience, because they may be coming in with some kind of irrational belief, but it's real important for you to be able to say, this is what I saw and heard. And I'm going to stop for a second because there's another question. One question is, how do you know that the crisis is over when it lasts for a week and week ongoing? It sounds like you've got a chronic crisis situation that would be something that, again, an individual team would need to be able to help sort out with you. And then we have another comment, is that the adult control piece is so important. Unfortunately, I think often adults don't take the time to do this. Totally agreed, especially if we see ourselves in the mode of helping the child. This is really what I'm talking about, is how to help the child gain control. The only way that can happen is if you are able to control your own adult behavior. And it's like what they say in an airplane when they tell you to put on the oxygen mask. If you're sitting next to a small child, make sure you put on your oxygen mask first before helping the child next to you. You really need to have that level of control. And again, being able to have someone in your life, another adult, that you can review this with before processing with the child is a way to help you get under control. Okay, so are we under control? That's the C. Are we orienting to the facts that happened? That's the O. Now let's look at the patterns. The child has the opportunity to look for patterns of behavior. When has this happened before? Where did it happen? What are some things that are going on before it happens? And what triggers the behavior? We see this a lot in schools when children come in from the bus. There might be some kind of significant acting out experience that happens in the morning, and we can track it back to something that's happening on the bus. Sometimes we see on a Monday morning in schools when a child has spent the weekend with a non-custodial parent in some sort of supervised situation, that there's a lot of anxiety the child's coming into school with, and begins to lose rational thought. And so on Monday, we're seeing that there's a pattern of this kind of behavior. So that's what we're doing here, is trying to establish, let's see if we can be detectives and figure out, when is this most likely to happen or not happen. And again, the adult can do that too, and point out what he or she sees might be going on. Okay, so we have go and calm, that's the C. We have orient, which is what actually happened. We have P, let's look for the pattern of when this happens, what happens before, during, and after. And now we're going to investigate some alternatives. So this didn't really work. We ended up in crisis here. There was some verbal acting out and physical acting out. Don't think anybody really wants that to happen. So what are some things we can do instead? What are some things that the adult can do differently and that the child can do differently to prevent this kind of escalation from happening in the future? So we're breaking it down to understanding the behavior enough to think about what changes might need to be made. And with this, contracting is usually good. This would be the child coming up with if I have a contract and I'm not verbally or physically out of control for this period of time, I might get some kind of reinforcement. This is where the adult could be looking at how to support the child when the behavior is not occurring. So it's investigating all the possibilities. And then we get into the N, which is negotiating. And this is where you come up with your plan for what's going to happen next time. And you agree on the behaviors that you're looking for, what's going to happen if you see the alternative to the problem behavior, and how that child is going to be positively acknowledged for not tantruming, and what might happen if the behavior occurs again, which in schools might be a little time out of recess or some kind of restitution. And the adult also agrees to changes the adult will make to help around the future to improve the possibility of success for the child. So we had C was calm, O was orient, P was patterns, I was investigate alternatives. Now you're negotiating the plan. And then with all of that processing, you get to give back control and freedom to the child, and the adult can also walk away feeling confident and capable that they have processed this enough so that they can move forward and see that child again without that awful pit in their stomach. So the child feels like, okay, we've processed this enough. I'm going to go, I've got your encouragement and your support to really try to do better. And then the adult also knows what he or she is going to do. So all of this sounds so simple and elegant, and all things that we've done. And you're all probably here because you've got children in your care that have had these kinds of pretty significant acting out experiences. All of these strategies sound simple and seem simple. It's being able to practice them and reflect on them after they occur and understand a child's behavior enough so that you can know what to do differently next time. So put them all together really, gives you a fuller base to operate from when a child begins to act out. And I can't encourage you enough to try to think about pulling all of these strategies into one place for yourself when you're working with a child in your care who's going into crisis. And then the other most powerful message about the whole thing is, especially not especially children who are verbal, but however children communicate, when they feel that they are being listened to, non-judgmentally, whatever their truth is, if they feel like you're listening to them, they're going to want to tell you their story. And in telling their story, you as the adult can help them sort out what's rational, what's irrational, and help them set on their way. So I just wanted to end with this as sort of a guiding strategy for all that you're doing, is really trying to separate your own personal piece from what's going on in a crisis situation and developing that capacity to really hear the child's end of the story. So that actually, that concludes the formal part of the presentation. Happy to take any questions, and then we'll end it with a little bit more of an announcement. What's the name of the website that you stated has things to read and learn? Well, the website that has some training offerings is www.pbisvermont.org, and that's spelled out, www.pbisvermont.org. You're welcome. Okay, a few more seconds. Okay, so I want to thank you for joining us for today's webinar. It will be archived on Vermont Family Network's website along with many other previously recorded webinars. Be sure to visit VFN's website at www.vermontfamilynetwork.org, and that's Vermont Family Network spelled out, .org, for a complete list of upcoming webinars, workshops, and support groups. You can also call for support and information the Vermont Family Network at 1-800-800-4005. That's 1-800-800-4005. And have a great day.